Hello, this is International Master and author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening. This is a show that explains positional ideas with a particular emphasis on pawn structures that recur throughout chess practice. This will be my third lecture on isolated pawns. Again, for quite a few lectures, we'll be looking at isolated queen's pawns and the structures which follow from them. After that, we'll look at some other types of isolated pawns. But let me start out by going back and re-emphasizing the importance of the isolated queen pawn and why it receives the lion's share of attention in the literature. I want to make these lectures maybe relevant to what you do, so I'm going to show some major opening variations which produce an isolated queen pawn. I'm going to do this in a superficial and impressionistic way, manually, just to give a feel for the breadth of this phenomenon of this isolated queen pawn before returning to specific examples and game examples. So I'm going to run through some of these. You'll probably find that there's an isolated queen pawn position which arises in at least one and perhaps many of the openings that you play, and naturally I'm not going to mention them all because that's impossible. Okay, the books tend to emphasize openings with 1d4 which lead to isolated queen pawn. And there are indeed more examples of that than with 1e4, but let me show you a few isolated queen's pawns stemming from 1e4 first, as they are up on your screen. Now, the Sicilian defense is not known for isolated d pawns, but after the move c3, for example, there are actually a lot more, but this is probably the most common one. We will get several possibilities. For example, simply here, probably know these lines, may know these lines. This is just a standard C3 Sicilian. Here's one of the variations, and at this point probably, well, there's various ways to do this, but let's just go here, maybe castle here, and well, at some point this happens, and there we go. There's the isolated d pawn in a fairly normal position. You know, the rook can come to e1 and black can castle. This is fairly similar to what we've seen, the open d file and the blockading knight. A little bit like the d pawn case, not completely obviously, but the same principles, and maybe we'll see some of these games later. Let me go back a little bit there and look at another c3 line. The other main answer actually to c3 is d5, and you get this kind of position. And as you can probably see already, this can easily lead to an isolated pawn position. Just for example, well, there's so many ways to do this. I suppose this is one of them. Just some simple setup like this, and take, and there we go. There's the isolated d pawn. You know, it can finish like that, and maybe queen d6 is best, maybe queen d8. And here we go again, very similar. This time the knight is not already blockading, it's back here, but that's typical of the types of isolated pawn. This one's almost exactly like the normal example that we look at. Okay, so let me now go back and look at something else, some other, you know, there are other Sicilian defenses that maybe are worth kind of looking at. I'll tell you, whenever black plays the freeing move d5, we will see, often we'll see after e takes d5 an isolated pawn position. This is, for example, just out of many examples, this is the Spassky-Fischer game that ended their match, their World Championship match. And in fact, Fischer played here right now, and there we are. That happened, and I think something like this happened. But we got very typical isolated pawn positions when Fischer is black out of a Sicilian defense. So it's a little unusual, but not impossible at all. So let's take a look at maybe some e4, e5 positions. I think that would be interesting because e4, e5 is not usually associated with isolated d pawns, but you get a lot of them. So let's just goof around with that for a second. Well, knight c6 is normal. Let's look at the Petrovs first. And actually, there's quite a few that come from here. The one I was going to show you is Well, there's a couple that are interesting here. Let me just show you this main line. It's probably the easiest. And then maybe just here, this one. There's plenty of options, as you know. It's not an opening theory course. And now there's lines with knight c6 and knight b4 where things get isolated. There's also just simple kind of positions like this where we end up with an isolated pawn. Like that. So it's a little different here because you'll notice this knight being here in front of the pawn is a little different, but it's the same idea. This pawn is isolated, gives white a lot of activity, files, and possibilities, attacking possibilities, maybe this kind of move, maybe some sort of pressure over here. Black is very solidly placed for the defense, and you get a typical isolated pawn position. Let's go back to, instead of the Petros, let's just play knight c6. And you can get all kinds of isolated pawn positions here too. I think let's first think about just old-fashioned thing. This is the Goring Gambit. And it can come up, this can come up from the Danish Gambit too, this kind of position, where we get an isolated pawn. So that's sort of a common Goring Gambit kind of position. You've probably seen this kind of thing before. Well, that's probably enough. Check here. And there's some famous Capablanca maneuver here, but we're not going to get too detailed. Here's the isolated pawn. White still gets, black's getting developed quickly here, but actually it's the same old idea. White's going to get some really strong activity pretty soon. Okay, and then what else can go on there that might be interesting? Well, instead of the Goring Gambit, I suppose, that also, by the way, that position comes up in the Chigorin defense to the Queen's Gambit declined. And there's always the Gioco Piano, which is probably the more familiar example, and that would go like this. And if you look at the old main line of the Gioco Piano, or one of them, you get a classic isolated pawn position. Some people claim is slightly better for white, and some people claim is equal. Okay, and black just blocks the center, and there it is. There's the isolated d pawn, and it's blockaded by that knight. White often goes here. Black can play knight a5, but we'll generally play here. White can castle, black can castle, and here you go. Here's your sort of standard isolated pawn. You might support it with that. White might use these files and get activity, maybe with the knight coming up. He's got a little more space to work with. Okay, standard stuff. So those are a couple d-pawn openings, e-pawn openings, and let's just see. As we saw last week, there are quite a few French defenses that lead to, well, there's a whole bunch of French defenses that lead there. What we looked at actually, well, here's a real quick one just to show you. Something like this can happen. It's very, very simple kind of position here, and I don't know. Let's just look at a few moves here. There are a lot of ways this can happen, but for example, maybe take here, and there it is. There's your isolated pawn position. Black might go like this and really try to blockade that square and maybe protect it even more. And same old thing, white has a lot of activity, a lot of nice files, a lot of space, good activity, but black has this strong bind on the d5 square. What else in the French defense? We could look, well, look what we looked at last week. We looked at the Tarrasch variation. And I think what we looked at actually was this position. There's other ways that you can get an isolated pawn. And you can go back to last week to take a look at this. But anyway, there it is. There's the isolated pawn. White has the blockading square here. Maybe plays here, that kind of thing. So same sort of principles, just to show you that you can get these out of a lot of positions. It would also be interesting to look at one other French defense. Well, no, that's okay. There's several others that lead to this. And what does that lead to next? Well, there's the Caro-Kann variation, a very famous one you may have heard of. It's the Panov-Botvinnik attack, and this very often leads to isolated pawns. This main line, now there's other ways to play for black, and there's other ways that lead to isolated pawns, but this is sort of a familiar way of getting there, where, for example, black might play there, or even this is pretty common too, this kind of move. Often you'll get this. Isolated pawn, blockaded, white simply defends, bishop d2 or something. And often black will go back soon, and maybe even immediately, but he'll go back with the bishop, and then we'll get a very familiar kind of position. This kind of thing. And sometimes actually, it's interesting, black will go back here and white will bring the bishop back here, and we've seen that kind of position before too. Okay, that's Caro-Kann. What else do we have in the Caro-Kann? Well, maybe out of the same variation, just another way of getting the same thing is for black to play there, and white could, for example, just take it. And black sets up the same blockade in front of the isolated pawn, and you get this sort of standard position. Okay, enough of that. Let's go back to more common d-pawn positions, but just to show you how often you'll get this kind of position, even in e-pawn. Okay, here's some d4 lines. The Nimzo Indian defense is maybe the most famous for isolated queen-pawn positions, and it's just replete with these kinds of variations. So we'll just look at one main line, which has several ways of getting there in and of itself. This is sort of your basic Nimzo Indian kind of position. And there's all kinds of orders which you can get to this way. For example, here's one way to do it. Here, and there we've got it. We've got the Nimzo Indian. Very similar to the Queen's Gambit and actually to a lot of the things we've already seen, even the Caro-Kann. So that's an opening that you'll see quite a bit. Often you'll get this kind of thing, which is worth seeing. And then we have our bishop g5 ideas and other ways to develop. But we've seen something similar to this. A lot of times the bishop will come back here. Okay, so then what else in the Nimzo Indian? Let's start with this same position right here, and let's look at this immediately. Actually, it's almost the same thing. Now, for example, this is one way to play it. Or what else? White could play castles first, and black could take. That would work too. This kind of thing. Again, isolated queen pawn, basic kind of position. White goes like this. Black either plays knight c6 or plays like this, or maybe even plays a6 and b5 to capture more of those light squares on the queen side. Okay, then we might have the Queen's Gambit accepted is another famous way of getting to isolated d-pawn positions. Just for example, well, maybe a good example right off the bat, just a simple one, is here, bishop takes, and then, not that they always play exactly that order, but there you go, isolated d-pawn, and black might just develop and maybe play that to restrain the d-pawn. White puts his pieces on active squares, castles, plays rook e1. Okay, that's one way to do it. A little bit more of a main line would be playing here first, and then, well, let's just look at a really main line with the old a6 and c5 stuff. That would go sort of like this, maybe castles, maybe a6. In the old days, Botvinnik against Petrosian, that kind of thing, they'd play a4. They still do. They play the Furman variation with queen e2. And we get this kind of thing. That would be one isolated pawn right there. Little bit different because the rook's on the d file this time, but very common to put a queen there and a rook on d1. Or if you don't play for some sort of a6 line, there's maybe some simple things like just c takes d4. It's a possibility. And just develop this kind of thing, and you see it again, the same sort of thing. Another system that commonly leads to isolated pawns is the semi-Tarrasch system, and there's many ways to get to that. For example, let's just try, it doesn't really matter, I guess, just play these moves. Pretty soon what happens is black plays c5, white plays e3, and we get this sort of symmetrical position or something similar to it. And probably, well, there's many ways to do this. Here's one way right away, something like this. And if black plays this way, then white can very soon play d takes c5, and black has an isolated pawn, one that we're pretty familiar with. Or maybe white plays, maybe black plays here, and white develops, and black gives white an isolated pawn. So the semi-Tarrasch is just full of all kinds of isolated pawns. And then there's Slav variations, Slav defense variations, like this, and there's a bunch of those too, like in the main or fairly main line. Well, in the semi-Slav, for example, we get from this kind of position. Let's try this line for a second. Maybe, well, okay, so maybe here, takes, castles, maybe the usually doesn't go quite this order, but it's quite possible. It has happened here. And again, we have this isolated pawn in front of an outpost. That could be covered by knight b6. And white has a lot of activity. The queen's already got a nice diagonal, and you have rook e1 and bishop g5, same old, same old. Whoops, sorry. Bishop b5, that kind of thing. What else in the Slav? Well, let's see. Maybe if he doesn't play d takes c. For example, maybe just something like, for example, this move. Actually, better get castled first before you make a move like that. Okay. And even now it's a little funny because there's this knight b5 move, but you could just take and isolate the pawn. And this is messy, but maybe it's the same. Maybe white's a little better, but the same idea. Isolated pawn here and blockading square, right, ready for a knight to go on there, and an open file. But great activity. Look, he's aiming at the king, and so we get the same kind of trade-offs that we always get. That's Slav defense, and I'm trying to think what. Well, there's the classical Queen's Gambit. That's worth taking a quick look at. Probably all know this. For example, maybe look at the Lasker variation. That would go something like this. I don't know. This is one way to get to this isolated pawn position. There are actually several. This is an old standard. You can get this from the Capablanca line too, except for the pawn not on h6. And just take my word for it. This is all ancient theory. And now a lot of times white will play that move, and there we go. Isolated pawn. Black can try and swing around and sort of blockade it. It's got open file. White has some interesting attack here because his rook can zoom over. And we'll see that's quite a theme, especially if you can't get d5 in. A lot of times the rook will transfer in a third rank. This rook. Sometimes the rook even comes over this way from the initial position and swings over. Okay, and there are other, obviously, Queen's Gambit, classical Queen's Gambit things, but they were kind of probably pounding this into the ground here. But let me just look at one more semi-Tarrasch then. We really basically looked at this already. Okay, and there we pretty much have it. Same idea, a little bit different timing because the knight's back here, but we've seen this position before. It's very, very standard kind of position. Okay, that's went on for a while, but I think it's important. So you get some feel for where these things are coming from and why they're so important. So let's go back to the most basic type of isolated queen pawn example with the themes. We're going to look at two of them if we get a chance. I think we will. Okay, this is Anatoly Karpov versus Lajos Portish. We've actually seen both of these fellows in our example before. Karpov will be a defender of the IQP again. I think this is the third time. He's considered one of the great defenders, but he's made some classic mistakes. He lost IQ pawn positions to Smyslov and Kasparov in a famous game, and this game also is very interesting in that respect. Defending against the isolated queen pawn can be a really difficult technical task, and in the books about the isolated queen pawn that I mentioned last week, it's amazing. Most examples are wins for the isolated queen pawn, which is probably not fair, but it shows that those are the most spectacular games and in many ways the most instructive games. So usually you'll see the books giving a lot of wins for white. I've been trying to be balanced here, actually. I think I've been about even with wins for white, black, and today we'll see some draws actually. Okay, let's just move on with this. Starts funny, but it gets into a Nimzo Indian. Okay, and we just said the Nimzo Indian is rife with these isolated D pawns, and one is coming up right there. So Karpov always tended to play this b6 system. That was his favorite. He played that for years. As I say, there are options, especially with the bishop here. You might want to look into this a6 b5. It tends to be a little better when the bishop is on c4. Okay, that's a strategic retreat. He's aiming at the king's side. It means he isn't going to be attacked with tempo. It means that he can perhaps line up like this. We've actually already seen these ideas to some extent with colors reversed. This is not threatened yet because if he takes twice, the bishop h7 will win the piece back. So he attacks the bishop, and this is a key point. Now some people will take there, and we'll be talking a lot about what are called isolated pawn couples and hanging pawns. Maybe even today, probably not, but next time for sure. So it's a big choice for black. Black could double these up, for example, get that kind of thing. And then what black's after is some position like this, maybe even with bishop d5, where he can conquer that square and hold down those light squares, and maybe put pressure here. So that's his idea if he takes. We'll see that kind of idea. in this position, black almost always retreats because he wants to defend. This piece is important to defend the king side, especially the dark squares, because his bishop's going to come out here, in some cases even here. So that bishop is useful to defend the king side. Okay, now there's this idea of setting up the attack. Okay, so all the normal sort of moves. This rook e8 move is partly prophylactic. It means that if d5 is played, there's going to be a capture, and that'll open up this file. There's some other reasons for it. This rook move is sort of self-evident. He's trying to get pressure right down that file. And white just tries to break through immediately. So this is interesting. Probably, in fact, rook c8 is probably just a mistake. I should have mentioned that. Probably it's time, even though this hasn't been played yet, threatening takes and mating ideas here. Probably black should play here to block it off in advance. That would be the proper way to do it. But instead, he plays this move, and that allows this break. Now it looks like that's covered, and we've seen this. I wanted to show this game because it's yet again an example of d5, which, as I say, in his career, Karpov kind of fell for several times. This actually should be almost winning for white because, okay, first of all, if knight takes, you've got this mate here, right, to go to the corner. In the meantime, black's threatening this and this. So the natural move is here. But then white plays this move. And even though he's a pawn down, he's threatening again to take that and then play queen h7 check, followed by mate. So black has some problems defending here because if he plays here, certainly a natural defending move and maybe what Karpov was counting on, white can simply play this move. Now if rook or knight takes, you win a piece and the dark squares. And if queen takes, you have this move, which the knight is pinned, and so you're on the queen and the knight and everything is falling apart. So he cannot play g6. So he plays here, no mean defender. But now white gets his pawn back and is threatening checkmate and has some pressure down here too. So there's some real problems here. Now he has to do that. He has to stop checkmate. And white goes over. You see these sensitive dark squares here. There's some idea of playing, well, look at this. He's got rook here. He's got maybe bishop takes followed by knight up. He's got bishop b3. It's a huge attack. And Karpov decides he can't allow the knight g5 with tempo and maybe even queen h6 in some lines. And he makes the most natural move in the world, and it turns out that's not probably the most accurate. It's pretty good, actually. It's probably still very, very strong, but he has an even better move here. If he just plays here, and remember what we said is once that pawn here has to take here, then the bishop returns to that diagonal. And when he returns to that diagonal, he has a nice open line. And this turns out to be sort of indefensible. Obviously, bishop takes g5, knight takes is just horrible. And white is threatening to play bishop takes h7 in a lot of lines, as well as just rook over to d1. It just turns out this is better timing because what happens here is that, for example, here he has a little trick. He doesn't need rook a d1. What is he threatening? This move, because that's pinned, and that's going to be a checkmate. So there's really nothing to do. He can try here, here, threatening queen g6 check again, and then here, and there's no way. Oh, excuse me. Actually, no. Then the king would escape. I was wondering what was going on there. This move first, threatening queen, which is going to be a checkmate really soon, or, well, that's a checkmate, and this one is going to be a checkmate really quickly, and he can't stop both of those moves. So this attack would come to its fruition with this move, bishop b3. Now, it just shows how hard it is to win a game, even if it's won, and especially against a great defender, because that was his only chance. Now, it looks like he's winning this. Well, he has one more chance. He could play rook e6 now with a very dangerous attack, but instead he follows through with what he was going to do in the first place, which is this. And now he thought, okay, I'm just winning. This is the end. If you look at this for a second, there's no sort of natural way to defend this position, but there's a sort of unnatural one, which Karpov had probably calculated a long time ago. He hits the queen, so that if queen takes, he can play queen takes here, and after that check, he's still attacking the queen. And so this is the way that black survives this game, amazingly, because he really was pretty lost, but it's hard to beat Karpov. So you'll just see what's going on here. I'm not going to go through any of this. Basically, white does have an extra pawn, but guess what? They're very weak and blockadable. There's an outpost. There's an outpost. So it's going to be really hard to win this. And I think objectively this is actually drawn. The knight is going to have outposts all over the place here. And white really doesn't have equivalent pieces. So we'll go through this really fast. I don't know if these are great moves or not, but we're just about at the end here. Black's going to be able to get rid of some pawns. That's it. They took a draw right here. Okay, let's see if we can move on and see another one. That showed a lot of basic themes. The D5 theme again. So we want to remember that theme and open piece play, but also just the defensive technique was interesting. Okay, here's a game between two more very famous players, Botvinnik and Floor. And again, we'll sort of zoom through the opening. This is one of those Queen's Gambit semi-Tarrasch positions. And you'll see that very soon, there we go. He establishes the isolated pawn, and we're going to get to a very familiar position. This time the knight's on d5, not on f6, and the bishop's on d3, not on c4. All combinations of those piece positions are played. Okay. Now, interesting move. He goes after the bishop, and his idea is to give extra support to that blockading square. Could also play bishop b1 there probably. Now he plays it. And black fianchettos as before and tries to cover the square. White. Okay, now we talked about when you can't get the d5 move in, and it really is overprotected in this case. Sometimes you do this you lift this rook up over to attack, and there are some other attacks that we'll see. There are quite a few options besides d5 for trying to get through in this position, but this is a pretty standard one. So it's something we can learn today about how to attack. We're really stuck with piece play now. Let me actually just go back a little. I think it would be interesting to sort of check a couple things. One thing is I want to show you this move. A lot of times this is very handy, this move. It's worth remembering because there's this rook d8 idea. Not only to think about winning this thing, maybe by coming back, but also just to get the pieces off the last rank. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then the other thing that I thought would be interesting is that after that move, knight e5 was a nice forward move. We've talked about it. That's a support point, even though it's not an outpost because it can be attacked. But another way to play, let me just show you just a sort of standard way of playing this. Drives him back to that outpost. Comes up here, got some sort of little mating ideas, so he hopes. And now the threat is knight takes knight, followed by taking here, and followed by checkmate. So black has to do something about that. He plays the standard thing. And white comes back now, switches diagonals, and we've seen this before. It's worth remembering that. You stop him, you force him to cut off this diagonal, and then you work on this diagonal. And try to break down that square, either by sacrifices or simply by eventually getting this d5 move in. But the bishop's more effective. Once g6 is played, often the bishop is more effective there. Okay, and that's just a variation where I might want to go a couple more moves. Okay, rook c8 is certainly natural. Black's playing all the normal moves. And now let's take a quick look there. That's the isolated pawn couple, which we'll be talking about quite a bit. And he does that partly to make that weak and that weak, but also to simplify and attack that pawn. That's sort of the key there. Now white has to worry about rook takes c3 or knight takes c3, so he comes back. He doesn't want to exchange. Pawns in the third rank are easier to defend than pawns in the fourth rank, like this isolated pawn. So white is not that unhappy here. He's created a weakness over here, and he has this knight e5 move. He has a lot of possible activity, and he has the idea of playing c4, which creates hanging pawns, but they can be very strong. Okay, so that's probably about all I'd say. Okay, for example, if here, and there we've got it. We've got the hanging pawns, these two, which look like they aren't that strong, but they can advance further, and that's the danger for black. Black might play here, and it turns out this is about an equal position. So that's a typical transformation there from isolated pawn to isolated pawn couple, and eventually to hanging pawns. So we'll see a lot of that. Okay, let's get back to the game before we run out of time here. There we go. And so white makes that rook lift. Once he stops trying to get d5 in, a lot of times he has to find some other way to attack. Okay, he could also play rook g3, which might be, just to show you real quick, okay, rook g3 might be a little more pointed, again with the idea of bishop g5 and just attacking that square. So in the game he plays here right away, And black plays g6, which is what he would have played anyway. I just want to show you that he has to play g6. Okay, with tempo, taking over this dark squares and attacking that rook. But here's the thing about the isolated pawn. It's not that weak. Just make that an isolated pawn couple right away. Then play here, typical defensive move, threatening checkmate. And then after he defends against checkmate, which might be, just for example, well, I guess this is probably the best. Then you can put this rook on a more useful open file instead of on rook e8, which was a little bit funny. And this is considered about equal, this kind of position. I mean, black has been weakened. On the other hand, look at white's white's weakness here. There's some control of the light squares, and it's very hard to break through these kind of squares. So, but what he did do was rook e8, and white just tried to kind of take over the dark squares over there. Black starts expanding on the queen side, but he's also stopping this move bishop b5, which is rather dangerous. So sort of double points to that move. White gets all his rooks, and now White's maximized his activity of all of his pieces in the way that you do when you have an isolated d pawn. Usually that means maximum activity. Look, they're all very active, whereas blacks are, they're stuck a little further back on the board. So they're pretty active, but White's got direct aggressive pieces that are reaching further into black's position. But his d pawn's still weak. Okay, so now White can't figure out how to get through, so he plays there, and you can see he's eyeing some possible sacrifices on g6. Now plays this move. If he played something like this, that would be fine, but he's got to be careful. This position's okay, but if he tries to get rid of the knight, there's just too many pieces away from that king side, and this is just going to win. Too many pieces here. This kind of sacrifice is pretty much always going to win. There. Now where can the king go? It's just a real problem. If he goes here, he runs into this with discovered attacks coming. And even this rook can join the fun. So that's a kill. Just as an example. But it was the knight d7 move that made that variation bad. Knight takes c3 is perfectly okay. He plays that instead to just attack the rook. And then he comes back again because the rook's no longer threatening this sacrifice. And now White could probably repeat or something, but he decides to keep attacking. And that's a good move. It protects the seventh rank. A lot of people, once they have an isolated pawn, they just want to defend for a while and then win in the endgame, or simplify and then win. Another move here was bishop b4. It's a pretty good move. The idea of kind of breaking up those pawns, it probably turns out to be about equal because it does abandon the kingside defense. So in the long run, that's a tough decision to make. Okay. Now we go into this business again. He goes back again, willing to take a draw. But White keeps trying to win. Now it turns out that's probably not a very good move. He's just trying to win, and maybe it's not justified. There's that isolated pawn couple we told about, and it's already restrained by this pawn. That's kind of nice. So it can't advance. It can't become hanging pawns without really being lost. So the only question is, can he stop the kingside attack? That probably wasn't the greatest move. He should probably just play here again, the little mate threat. And it's kind of hard to defend. I mean, if he plays here, you can divert the rook, and then you still have that mating idea, and you win a pawn right away. If he plays, what would he play here, for example? He might play, see, f3 is not going to work either because of rook c3, because that cuts off the defense. So I guess queen f1, but that's very passive, and now you figure black's probably better. In fact, it's harder to defend these squares. So you see the attacks disappeared. So that was a very good way for black to play. He didn't do that. I want to show you that black has resources, not just white. It's not only white that's always attacking here. Sometimes it's black. So instead he played this b4 move, probably not best. White goes back again with the same kind of attack. And black decides to get grabby, but he allows this move, attacking the queen and blasting forward in the center. Now, obviously if he takes that, we've got a checkmate in one. Black had probably seen this coming, probably wasn't too worried about it because he has this move, this defensive move. Typical back and forth here. This is more typical of a real game than the kind of slaughters we've seen so far. Okay, White comes back with the idea again, maybe of piling up there. Takes, this checks, and now Black's wants some material, but the problem is this is very weak, the king side's weak, so it's just a double-edged game. It's probably bishop c5 was the right move there. Probably with some advantage, actually, because white really can't get through. But here, there's just enough time. And in fact, it might have been good for white to just play this move now, a little tactical move, with maybe just a tiny advantage. Okay, let's look at this now. So he gets to get rid of that piece. And it turns out that after all is said and done, this is about an equal game. And it ends in a draw. I won't try to explain that, but it ends in a draw very quickly. Oh, see, that exchange stack's interesting because now he's on this one and he's got the two pieces for the rook without having to worry about his king getting killed. You have to go over these. You have to go over these moves. I didn't explain that very well. In fact, it was drawn right now. So that's an example of the kind of dynamic balance that a lot of times comes with that isolated queen pawn. It's not like just white blows black away. Black had winning chances in that game, chances to get a huge advantage. So did white earlier. So basically, that's very typical of the isolated queen pawn play, is that both sides have decent chances of advantages, and it's a very double-edged and fun game. Okay, thanks. So we'll talk next week. This has been Beyond the Opening with John Watson. Thank you very much.